Imagine you haven't eaten in 3 days. You found the herd. You tracked them, mapped the route, and all that's left is to go. Then the sky opens. Not a passing shower, a cold, driving rain that won't quit for days straight. Now you can't hunt. The trail's washed to mud. The stream by your shelter is a river, and the fire keeping the dark away is drowning in its own smoke. You're not bored, you're trapped. Today, a week of rain means you refill your coffee, put on a show, and complain about the drive home. You might even like the sound of it against the window. For someone living tens of thousands of years ago, that exact same sound falling for days on end could kill in more than one way before it ever let up. The first threat is cold. A wet body loses heat many times faster than a dry one, and without proper clothing or a sealed shelter, a sustained cold rain can drop your core temperature into dangerous territory within hours, even somewhere that feels mild by daylight. Nightfall made it worse everywhere, including large parts of ancient Africa at higher elevations, where temperatures could fall sharply once the sun went down. The second threat is water itself. Most of the places people actually lived, caves and rock overhangs near a reliable water source, sit close to rivers or at the base of slopes for good reason, and that same geography turns dangerous fast in a sustained downpour. Archaeologists have found layers of flood sediment sealed inside caves that were clearly occupied at the time, and in several of those sites, the occupation record simply stops after that layer, suggesting the flood was bad enough that people never came back. The third threat is other predators, because heavy rain pushes every animal toward shelter, and sometimes that shelter is the exact same cave a family is already using. There are cave sites in southern Africa where human remains and large cat remains turn up in the very same layer, and a number of those human skulls carry puncture marks that line up almost exactly with the size and spacing of a big cat's teeth. Rain did not just make life unpleasant, it crushed predator, prey, and person into the same small dry space at the same time. And none of these three threats worked alone. A body already losing heat to cold rain reacts slower to a predator's approach. A flooding entrance cuts off the one dry retreat a family had left, and every hour that passed without a break in the weather stacked those risks on top of each other instead of resetting them. That compounding effect is really what made a multi-day storm so different from an ordinary bad afternoon. In the middle of all of it, one task outranked everything else: keeping the fire from dying. Here is why that mattered so much. Controlling an existing flame and creating a brand new one from nothing are two completely different skills. And for most of human history, plenty of people almost certainly could not do the second one reliably. There is solid evidence of controlled fire use going back roughly 400,000 years at a site called Qusem Cave in modern-day Israel, and some researchers argue for fire use as far back as nearly 1 million years at Wonderworks Cave in South Africa. But controlled use is not the same as ignition on demand. So, if a fire actually went out during a week-long storm, a group might not have been able to start another one from scratch, which meant carrying an ember was sometimes the only backup plan. Some groups wrapped a smoldering coal in green leaves, or packed it inside a dense woody fungus that grows on tree trunks, which could hold a spark and smolder quietly for hours, functioning almost like a biological lighter. We know this was a deliberate, practiced habit, not a guess, because when researchers examined the naturally mummified remains of a traveler who died in the Alps roughly 5,300 years ago, they found a complete fire-starting kit tucked into his belt pouch: tinder fungus, flint, a lump of iron pyrite for striking sparks, and backup plant tinder. Losing your fire was still serious enough, thousands of years after the Ice Age ended, that people carried dedicated tools to prevent it. And similar fire kits, in slightly different forms, keep turning up at sites across very different regions and time periods, which suggests this was not one clever individual's trick, but a piece of standard knowledge passed down deliberately, generation after generation, precisely because losing it once could be fatal. So, when the rain started, protecting the flame came before almost everything, moving it deeper under cover, shielding it with hide or brush, feeding it just enough and never too much. People learned to hunt for dead lower branches still hanging under a thick tree canopy, since those stayed dry even in a soaking storm, and to split open wet logs to reach the dry heartwood inside. Birch bark became a favorite fire starter because it contains a natural oil that keeps burning even when the outer bark is damp. During a long storm, one person's entire job might have simply been sitting beside that fire for hours at a stretch, tending it, guarding it, making sure it survived until the sky cleared. Because that fire was warmth, light, safety, cooked food, and the center of every conversation the group would have. There is another piece of this puzzle worth mentioning, and it rarely comes up. Some hunter-gatherer groups documented in more recent history developed genuinely sophisticated ways of predicting a multi-day storm before the first drop ever fell. Watching how certain ants sealed their mounds, noting unusual bird flight patterns low to the ground, or tracking a specific shift in humidity against the skin. Groups that read those signs early could stockpile extra dry firewood, extra food, and extra tinder before getting trapped, which turned an emergency into something closer to a planned inconvenience. That kind of environmental literacy does not show up in the archaeological record the way a stone tool does, but it was very likely one of the most valuable survival skills a person could carry. With the fire holding and the group mostly dry, the next question becomes obvious. What do you actually do with all that forced stillness? You make things. The archaeological record inside caves is packed with evidence of manufacturing, stone tools at every stage of completion, and dense clusters of tiny flaking debris. The small chips that fly off while shaping a blade, concentrated in exactly the kind of spot where someone would sit near firelight for hours. But it goes well beyond stone. At Blombo's Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered a genuine pigment workshop roughly 100,000 years old, complete with abalone shells used as mixing containers, ground ochre powder, and bone tools clearly used to stir and apply it. That is not desperate survival behavior. That is organized production. Someone sitting in that cave, likely while rain hammered outside, running an actual small manufacturing process on purpose. Bone needles start showing up in the record around 61,000 years ago in southern Africa and later across Europe and Asia. Delicate tools with tiny drilled eyes that nobody makes while fleeing danger. You make a needle like that when you are sitting still with hours of uninterrupted time, which a multi-day storm handed people constantly. This is where it gets genuinely interesting. At a Neanderthal site called Abri du Maras in France, archaeologists recovered a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber cord dating back roughly 52,000 years, among the oldest confirmed evidence of string ever discovered. At Hohlefels Cave in Germany, researchers found a 35,000-year-old tool carved from mammoth ivory, drilled with several holes and cut with spiral grooves, built specifically for twisting plant fibers into rope. Someone sat down and engineered a dedicated rope-making device. Making cord by hand is slow, repetitive, and demands patience, which makes it close to the ideal bad weather task. And rope changed nearly everything that came after it, tying shelters together, building snares and traps, lashing tools to handles. A staggering share of human technology depends on string somewhere in its history, and it was very likely invented by someone stuck indoors with nothing to do but wait for the sky to clear. People were not only making tools during those long, wet stretches, they were making their shelters livable. At Sibutu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists discovered something unexpected from around 77,000 years ago. Actual bedding, layered sedges, reeds, and grasses, arranged deliberately as sleeping mats, topped with leaves from a plant that naturally repels insects. This was not just surviving inside that cave. It was making it a home, and the evidence shows those bedding layers were burned off and rebuilt periodically to keep them clean, meaning people were practicing a working version of pest control 77,000 years before anyone used that phrase. There is likely a nutritional cost hiding underneath all of this comfort, though. Researchers studying ancient teeth and bones have identified something called growth arrest lines, faint bands that form in developing teeth and bone whenever a young body goes through a period of serious nutritional stress and then recovers. In regions with long, unpredictable wet seasons, these lines often cluster at intervals that line up with expected rainy stretches, suggesting that even with fire, tools, and shelter mastered, extended rain still quietly cost people calories they could not always replace right away. Everything up to this point counts as practical. What came next is something else entirely. Deep inside Chauvet Cave in southern France sit paintings roughly 36,000 years old. Lions, horses, rhinoceroses, and bears rendered with a level of anatomical accuracy and motion that still stuns people who study it. Some animals appear captured mid-stride, muscles visibly tensed, heads turned as if reacting to something. These are not casual scratches. They are the work of people who had spent countless hours watching these animals and then recreated them from memory, far underground, working only by the light of a small burning lamp. Chauvet is not an isolated case. Sites at Lascaux and Altamira show similar mastery, and cave art found in Sulawesi, Indonesia, has been dated to at least 45,000 years old, making it among the oldest confirmed figurative art on the planet. What makes this stranger still is where these paintings sit. They are almost never near a cave entrance, where you would naturally take shelter. They are deep inside, sometimes hundreds of yards, through tight, crawling passages. In chambers, a person had to work to reach it all. Somebody carried a small oil lamp into total darkness and painted there deliberately. Nobody does that on a clear afternoon with good hunting outside. You do that when the rain has been coming down for days. Every tool you own is already finished and sharpened, and there is genuinely nothing left to do except go further into the dark and make something. It cannot be proven outright that cave art began as a rainy season activity, but the pattern lines up too cleanly to dismiss. Some of the most creative achievements in human prehistory show up in exactly the conditions where people were most likely trapped indoors for extended periods. That connects to something even larger, because rain may not have only produced art, it may have helped produce culture itself. Picture a group of perhaps 15 to 30 people, forced into close quarters together for days, with genuinely nothing else to do. You talk. You listen. You pass information back and forth constantly. In a study published in 2014, the anthropologist Polly Weissner compared daytime conversations against nighttime fireside conversations among the Jew-Hoense people of the Kalahari Desert. Daytime talk tended to stay practical: land use, resources, complaints. Nighttime talk around the fire shifted dramatically, with the overwhelming majority of conversation turning towards stories, songs, and shared ceremony. Firelight itself seemed to change what people were willing to say, softening the mood and lowering social tension enough for people to actually open up. A campfire was never just a heat source. It functioned as the original social network, and what got shared there was rarely idle chatter. It was survival knowledge: where water still ran during a dry stretch, which plants were safe, where the best tool-making stone could be found, how to track one particular animal. On top of that came something less practical, but arguably just as important: myths and explanations for the rain itself, why it came, and where it went. Nearly every ancient culture on record has its own rain mythology, and someone had to invent each one of those stories, almost certainly while sitting inside the exact situation the story was trying to make sense of. There is another social layer worth mentioning here, because forcing that many people into one dry space for days at a time creates real friction, and cultures developed specific customs to manage it. Several groups studied by anthropologists maintain what researchers call joking relationships, structured pairs of people, often between certain in-laws or age groups, who are expected to tease each other freely, alongside opposite avoidance relationships where certain people are expected to keep a respectful distance and limit direct conversation entirely. Both customs, on the surface silly or overly formal, function as pressure valves, giving a crowded, storm-bound group built-in ways to release tension or sidestep conflict before it turned into something dangerous. Living in close quarters for a week without any social rules for managing friction would have been its own kind of hazard. And there is something about how long these stories lasted that shows exactly how powerful that transmission really was. Among the oldest verified oral traditions on record are Australian Aboriginal stories describing sea level changes from roughly 7,000 years ago, confirmed independently by modern geological surveys. Those stories survived purely through people telling them to each other, generation after generation, with no writing involved at all. That kind of cultural memory does not form by accident. It requires groups spending enormous amounts of time doing exactly one thing: sitting together and repeating stories again and again until they became permanent. So those long, wet stretches were never dead time. They were transmission time. The days when knowledge passed from the old to the young, when skills were taught hands-on instead of explained, when a group's shared memory got reinforced and quietly updated. And here is something people rarely mention. Extended rain was not purely bad news. Sometimes it was the best thing that could happen. Once heavy rain lets up, the ground softens into perfect tracking conditions, deep, clear, and easy to read, showing exactly which animals passed, how recently, and in which direction. Rain also meant water security. Natural rock basins that fill during a storm show up near almost every known prehistoric campsite, and several show clear signs of being deliberately carved deeper to hold more of it. Food changed rather than disappeared. Certain mushrooms and edible plants surge after heavy rain. Tubers pull free from softened soil far more easily, and insects surface in enormous numbers. Termites are a perfect case, swarming after rain across tropical regions and offering an incredibly protein dense meal requiring no tools or weapons whatsoever, just patience. Modern chimpanzees still gorge themselves during these swarms, and it is close to certain that early humans exploited the exact same opportunity, likely on a much larger scale. So, what did ancient humans actually do through a week of unrelenting rain? Everything that mattered. They protected the one fire keeping them alive. They built the tools they would need for the next hunt. They stitched the clothing that would carry them through the next cold season. They twisted the cord, holding their shelters and traps together. They ground the pigment that would end up painted on a cave wall far underground. They told the stories that carried survival knowledge safely from one generation into the next. And when the rain finally broke, they stepped back outside onto soft ground covered in fresh tracks and got straight back to work. That stretch of rain never actually slowed them down. It bought them the time to prepare for everything waiting on the other side of it. Every tool, every stitch of clothing, every story, every painted animal on a cave wall, all of it came out of forced stillness, out of the hours and days when leaving simply was not an option, and all that was left to do was sit near a fire and think. Boredom, in the way we experience it, was not really available to them because when you are sitting inside, listening to rain hammer down for the fourth straight day, and your survival depends on what your hands can produce before it stops, you do not drift into boredom. You get resourceful, and that instinct may be one of the biggest reasons any of us are still here at all. Every time modern life hands you an empty, rained in afternoon and it feels unbearably slow, it is worth remembering that the exact same stretch of forced stillness once produced the needle, the rope, the painted cave wall, and the story that outlived everyone who ever told it.